session, or a new series, I should say. We're always starting a new session each time, aren't we? Well, this time we're going to take a look at Mark, the Gospel. We're going to look in particular at Mark 1, verses 1 through 3 in our first session in this series. Now, I must tell you that this is going to be a little bit longer series if we do all of Mark, and that right now would be my intent. It's the shortest of the four Gospels. It's one of the three synoptic. My mouth's not working already. One of three synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means seeing together. So these are the three Gospels that look more alike. The third one, the Gospel of John, is quite different from these three. And this, like all Gospels, is an anonymous document. There's no statement about who the author is. Well, until the 19 or 1800s, Mark wasn't given as much attention and notoriety as the other Gospels. There were reasons. Mark was considered an abridged version of Matthew, and if you have the longer version, why get too concerned about the shorter version? It's Greek. The Greek of the writer was considered rough and ungrammatical, and at the same time Semitic in flavor. So whoever this writer was, he wasn't as fluent as a Paul or even a Peter, for that matter. The apostolic fathers and the following generation of what are called the apologists, early church fathers, but the third round, we start with the apostles, then the people the apostles taught directly, or some apostle taught directly, were called apostolic fathers, and those who were connected with the apostolic fathers that made up the next generation were called apologists. And all of these guys wrote very little about the Gospel of Mark. It was not part of the Gospel's title. Mark, that is, was not part of the Gospel's title until AD 125. So for a long time it was just simply a Gospel. But similar to a well-known comedian, and some of you are old enough to remember this guy, he said, "I get no respect." And apparently that happened with Mark. There wasn't a lot of respect or concern given, although it was part of the canon by the mid-300s, but there was not that much done or said about Mark. Of course, that's not exactly correct that they got no gospel. There were some early writings concerning Mark's gospel. But note what this gospel did not contain. The Gospel of Mark contains no record of events surrounding the birth of Christ. There's no incarnation events, if you please. In fact, there's no statement of the birth of Jesus or of John the Baptist, for that matter. And by the way, I'm going to call John the Baptist JB. There's no genealogy for Jesus, no pedigree. He was simply a servant. He was the servant, the suffering servant of God in Mark's view. There's no appearance of Gabriel recorded, either to Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, or to Mary. There's no mention of Joseph's involvement. And there's not much about Jesus' relatives. Nothing on Jesus' first 30 years of life. It just simply starts when Jesus is about 30, where he's preparing to begin his ministry. Everything in Mark, as I said, begins with Jesus' ministry, likely about age 30, including really only 3 events, the first 3 that we will see in our first 3 sessions. JB's ministry, Jesus' baptism by JB, incidentally, and then Jesus' temptation, of course, temptation by Satan. There's nothing early on about Jesus as the Messiah, nothing about the earliest disciples as described by the Gospel of John, where J.B. pointed people to Jesus. There's nothing about that. Nothing about Jesus' early Judean ministry, the cleansing of the temple, a visit by Nicodemus, the woman at the well, his first miracle at Cana. Nothing about any of those things. Early healings, no. And his move to Capernaum, no. None of that. Mark is a slimmed down document. Just a note, John the Baptist was the last of the Old Testament prophets, and he marked the transition into a new era. Luke tells us that, and Luke 16:16 says the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since then, the gospel of the kingdom of God is preached. And of course, John the Baptist was the transition prophet for all of that. A simple declarative sentence opens the gospel. Mark 1:1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Did you notice something? That's not even a complete sentence. There's no verb in there. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's simply an expression. Some scholars believe that Mark created the genre of the gospel as a form of Christian writing. It is not fundamentally historical in purpose, although it is historical. It's not a biography specifically, even though it talks about many aspects of Jesus' ministry. It is rather a theological proclamation for a particular audience, centering on the historical events of the Incarnation. But to reconsider the gospel, there must have been a change of attitude and belief about this document. And there was. For a variety of reasons, in the 1800s, scholars tend to believe that Mark was in fact the first gospel written. Prior to that time, it was considered that Matthew was the first gospel written. Now, the book of Matthew includes 90% of the stuff from Mark. Luke includes at least 40% of that from Mark. Over 600 verses of Mark, and Mark's only 661 verses long. Of those 661, over 600 verses are found in at least one of Matthew and Luke. And for a number of other reasons, it is now believed by most scholars that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources. All three use more sources than Mark, including Mark, of course, and those sources were probably a combination of oral sources, oral traditions, and written documents. Well, generally speaking, the Gospels are not recollections of a single author, but are, in a sense, a community effort, with the author picking and choosing what his sources had given him. So virtually all of these guys put together something that was already floating around. And Luke made that pretty clear. Look at Luke chapter 1, his introduction in verses 1 and 2. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us. So what is Luke saying? There were a lot of people who were trying to collect this information. And he said that's where most of us started, was with all of these different inputs. And then we created our own version for publication, although I'm sure they weren't thinking of publication as we think of the term now. Apparently, the nature of Mark's gospel was forged by three considerations: the setting in which Jesus lived, the setting for the life of the church after his crucifixion and after Pentecost, and then the life setting of the author himself. So what we're saying is that apparently Mark took into account the culture and the settings for the life of Jesus, the church, and himself. So there could be a lot of personal information in these Gospels. Number of questions about the Gospel of Mark are not directly answered in Scripture. For example, who is the author? Remember I said it's anonymous. Where was he when he wrote this Gospel? To whom and for whom did he write? When did he write the Gospel? What was his purpose? None of those things are directly answered in the Gospel itself. And so you have to read between the lines and read what scholars have said and look and make these choices for yourself. On the case of who wrote the Gospel, early church fathers were nearly unanimous on the authors being John Mark of the New Testament, a young man probably known infamously because of the breakup that he brought between Paul and Barnabas. But apparently one who was also reconciled to Paul later. Apparently, John Mark had a relationship with Peter, which predated his introduction to Paul. Think about it for a minute. Peter, after Pentecost, was in prison at one point. The angel came and released him. He went to the house of John Mark's mother. And remember, he was knocking at the door, and the girl who answered thought it was his ghost. Well, evidently there was some connection between Mark, or John Mark, and Peter. There have been some who theorized that there was a different Mark who was the author, but there seems to be absolutely no evidence to support that belief. So most of the people end up coming back to John Mark as the author, which leaves an interesting question. Since an apostolic connection was required to get into the canon, why was Mark accepted? And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. The where question results in three possible places that scholars have come up with. One is that John Mark was writing from Rome. Another group said no, he was writing from Alexandria in Egypt. And their reason for that was that today, yet today, the Egyptian Coptic Christians claim John Mark as their patron apostle, even though he was never a traditional apostle. He was not an eyewitness apostle, even though he saw some things during Jesus' life. He was not one of those who traveled with Jesus and so forth, at least as far as we know. And Syria has also been considered a place where the writing may have taken character. That didn't sound too good, did it? It's where the writing took place. But there is one reference, only in Mark. Any believe showed his presence during the last days of Christ. What am I talking about? Remember in the garden after Jesus came back and confronted the crowd and he was arrested and it said all of the disciples fled? Well, I'm going to read from Mark 14 from the author himself, verses 51 and 52. A certain young man, and this is the man that most people feel was John Mark. A certain young man was following him, that's Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they, that is the authorities, seized him. But he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. We get a chuckle out of that, thinking about that scene. But that's the one scene where people believe in the book of Mark that Mark refers to himself. Proof? No. That's just what is assumed. Most scholars have settled on Rome, where Mark apparently spent time with Peter before Peter's execution by Nero. Still leaves up the question of when, but they believe that he did spend time in Rome with Peter. If that's the case, then a number of characteristics of the document itself point to the Gentile Roman believers as a target audience for the gospel. And we'll mention those as we go along. The dating of the gospel seems to settle on 2 points of time. Some believe that it was written in the late 50s, AD 50s, not 18, not quite that late. The late AD 50s before Peter's martyrdom in AD 64, perhaps between AD 57 and 59. That's what some scholars have come up with. But others believe that Mark wrote this after Peter's death, probably somewhere between AD 67 and 69. Notice none of them go as far as AD 70, when the temple was destroyed, thinking that there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So this probably happened at least before AD 70, and my money would be on the earlier, sometime between AD 57 and 59. Because of some early writings, the 57 to 59 is actually favored, it seems. Such a date gave time for Matthew and Luke to have been written before AD 70, that destruction, again, of the temple. And there is reason to believe that, in fact, this did happen before that destruction. And also, though, even before an earlier point, because Luke, for example, was with Paul, and I believe Paul was in prison until like AD, 60 to 62? And Luke's writing would have been after that. so somewhere after AD 62. Both Matthew and Luke seem to have toned down some of Mark's rhetoric. Remember, this is a rough grammarian, and so he's in your face at times, and some feel that the other two writers, Matthew and Luke, have toned down that rhetoric as they wrote. Again, Mark's gospel has a distinct theological bent as opposed to a biological favor. Remember, the gospel is not a biology. It's not purely history, although it has some biology-like insertions, and it is certainly speaking of historical events. But in the Gospel of Mark in particular, Jesus' actions take precedent over his words. There are 18 miracles recorded by Mark, but only 4 parables. The parables that Jesus used for teaching. So almost 5 times as many miracles as teaching parables. And there's only one single major discourse of Jesus. And he had several in the other Gospels, but only one in Mark, and we'll point that out when we came to it. It probably won't be too difficult for you to figure out which one of Jesus' discourses or long discussions Mark would have picked, since roughly 1/3 of the book of Mark covers the last week of Jesus' life. So that's where you would expect to find it, of course. The dominant theme of Mark includes Jesus' intentional movement toward the cross and his crucifixion. In other words, this didn't happen willy-nilly. Jesus was looking forward to the cross, and everything he did was moving in that direction. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection so well put into perspective by Peter. We can see that in Acts 2:36. And remember, this is the Peter that we believe Mark was associated with. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know for certain, God has made him, Jesus, both Lord and Christ, the Jesus whom you crucified. Seems to me I may have skipped something earlier, and I'm not sure. What I missed earlier was a connection between Peter and Mark, found in 1 Peter 5, verse 13. She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings. And don't worry about who that was. The next phrase is what I wanted to point out. So it says, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Is Mark his son? No, but he's referring to Mark by a fatherly bent of some sort. Okay, so anyhow, Peter made that connection. Son of Man is used 12 times in Mark, Mark's favorite term for Christ, Son of Man. The word Christ, the reference to Christ as part of Jesus' title, was used only once in Mark. So he's concentrating on the suffering servant more than the conquering Messiah. A major key, God's power to save through Christ. That's one of Mark's favorite keys, the ability of God to save people through Jesus the Christ. Jesus is portrayed as the servant of God, which you can find in Isaiah Isaiah wrote extensively using that notion, the servant of God. As a document of action, there's one key word you're going to see. That's the key word, immediately. Immediately occurs 40 or 41 times in Mark. That's more than is used by all three other gospel writers combined. So 41 times in 660 verses. I didn't figure out what does that mean. This means about one in less than 20 verses, you will find the word immediately. So seldom go more than 20 verses before you see the word immediately. Sense of urgency, a sense of immediacy is obvious. Let's move now to verse 2 and 3 of Mark. We'll be getting into Mark here just a tad, and then we'll get into short passages the next couple of times. Remember, I said that the three startup events of Jesus' ministry, the three startup events were the beginning of JB's ministry, the baptism of Jesus by JB himself, and then the temptation in the wilderness, the temptation of Satan. So that's what's coming up for the next three sessions after this one. I'm going to read Mark 1, verses 2 and 3. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of Yahweh, the way of the Lord. All caps. Make his paths straight. You need to take some of these verses, some of these Old Testament references, and what is said about them with a grain of salt. For example, Mark says this comes from Isaiah. Well, it does, but it's moderated by verses out of the Psalms and out of what? Micah or Malachi. That would be the Italian version, wouldn't it? Oh, well. The first quote in verse 2, the messenger, the angel, is Yahweh's messenger, sent to prepare the way for another. I want you to check this carefully, because we're going to go look at these verses that this is taken from. Behold, I, Yahweh, send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. So this your is referring to someone other than the Yahweh who is speaking. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, that's the voice of the messenger, of course. Make ready the way of Yahweh. Make his path straight. So he got Yahweh speaking about somebody's way other than he being prepared, but yet he says the voice will say, make the way of Yahweh straight. Sounds confusing. Well, it's not. Note again, the messenger is Yahweh's messenger, sent to prepare the way for someone else, but yet the message is prepare the way for Yahweh. So the question is the another also called Yahweh? While Mark claims Isaiah is the prophet, as I mentioned a moment ago, the passages he quoted are really a combination or an allusion to at least three passages. It has a relationship to two Old Testament passages, neither of which comes from Isaiah. The first one is in Exodus 23:20, and this is Yahweh speaking. Behold, I'm going to send an angel, I'm going to send a messenger before you, and he's speaking to Israel. This is during the Exodus, of course. To guard you along the way, so I'm going to send an angel to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place which I have prepared, which of course was Canaan. So you're going to have an angel leading the way for Israel. But don't take angel too seriously there, folks. And in Malachi 3:1, Yahweh speaking again, behold, I'm going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek, that would be Adonai, not Yahweh. But, of course, Adonai is one of Yahweh's names. And Adonai, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. Adonai's temple. The messenger of the covenant, that's another title for the one who is coming. In whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says Yahweh of hosts. Seems clear that Mark wishes to emphasize the way. To do so, he makes a slight adjustment of Malachi from Yahweh to some unidentified person. Remember, Yahweh was saying, according to Mark's translation, Yahweh was saying he's sending the messenger before your faces to prepare your way, a third person. So from before you in Mark versus before me in Malachi, and we're not stopped there yet. And by the way, and there's no pun intended here, a wordplay was used by Malachi, whose own name means Yahweh's messenger. Malachi is a bit different from Mark, of course. While Mark implies that the messenger was to clear the way for someone, you, Malachi indicated the Yahweh's messenger was to clear the way for Yahweh himself. Still confused? Hang in there. It'll straighten itself out. Malachi goes on to add Adonai, sovereign Lord. Adonai's following the way clearing, then goes unannounced to the temple. What does early in John say? That Jesus went to the temple and cleared it. Then Malachi adds one given only as messenger of the covenant, also coming to Israel after the way clearing. So Malachi sounds as if multiple personalities were to come after the way had been cleared. Yahweh, Adonai, the messenger of the covenant. So, 1, 2, or 3 people, personalities, anyhow, not necessarily humans. Mark's shortened version in verse 2 has only one for whom the way was to be cleared. Look at Isaiah 40, verse 3. A voice is calling, and here is the reference that Mark said came from Isaiah when he gave the whole thing. Clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. So how many come after the Waymaker? How many come after JB? As we'll see later. 1, 2, or 3? Well, I think you already know that I believe the answer is one. Yahweh in the person of Jesus Christ, the Savior, Messiah, second person of the Godhead, will fit all three descriptions from Malachi. So while you had three descriptions, I believe they're all speaking of the second person of the Trinity. As did, I believe, the reference that we looked at from Exodus. So I think we'll stop here and continue with verses 4 to 8 next time. Actually, I'm not sure. We're probably just going to take 4, 5, and 6 next time. But we'll see. And we'll begin to unravel the mystery of the numbers game. Mark, the shortest of all the Gospels, ought to fit a short series, right? Well, if we do all of Mark in our usual verse-by-verse fashion, as you can see, we've only looked at 3 verses this time. We're only going to look at 3 verses next time. This series will be at least 35 sessions long, and that would be the quick version. We could easily run 40 to 50 sessions to get through Mark. Is it worth taking that much time? Absolutely.